It's not just, is there money or money to be made? It's who are you working with? Because I've seen great companies implode, and I've seen relatively crap companies do really well because of the people.
Welcome to the I Own It podcast with Ben Reinberg.
We're live in Laguna Beach, California at the Ben Reinberg I Own It studios today. We have another incredible guest that came down here from the Northwest. I'm really grateful for it. Jared Reimer, thank you for joining us today. What a privilege, and thank you for coming in studio.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So you've been at the heart of some really cool technologies over the past 25 plus years, from the rise of the internet, products like Nest to the cloud. Let's kick things off. Share some more, in your words, your career in tech up to this point now.
Sure, yeah. So when I was a kid, my parents went to the JCPenney, and they were having a clearance sale on the Texas Instruments 99 4A personal computer, and they bought one randomly, and I was elementary aged, and instantly I knew what I wanted to do. So I've never for a second done anything but worked with computers and technology. I got a 1200 baud modem. I got into bulletin boards. I ran a bulletin board. One day, a guy that I knew got a very early internet connection and showed me this thing called Mosaic that was the very first web browser. And it was the most magical thing I'd ever seen. So I knew from a very early age what I wanted to do. I got into the University of Washington a year early, got into the computer science program, did undergraduate and graduate computer science. During that time, I helped a ex-Microsoft guy build one of the very first dial-up internet service providers in Seattle. We were the first with $20 flat rate dial-up, which was great for the customer, but not great business, as it turns out. That company went on to do application hosting. We were an early DSL provider, so very early broadband. I helped to form and build what is now the world's largest free internet exchange point. This is the Seattle Internet Exchange, and it currently moves about 2.5 terabits per second of backbone traffic, so massive amounts of traffic. The ISP in Seattle was called Oz.net, and that company got acquired by The River, which was based in Tucson, Arizona. The River had bought up, I want to say 7 or 8 independent ISPs, and I joined as the VP of Operations, was tasked with integrating the networks and systems of all these different, because everyone did it differently. There was no standardization back then. This was like the very beginning of the dial-up era. And that company ran into some financial difficulties when its investors backed out. CEO was let go. I was about 25, and for reasons unknown, they decided I was the guy to run it. So having had no business background, being purely in technology, and faced with a company that was teetering on the brink of collapse, I was told, here you go, figure it out. And I learned a lot, so I got my MBA the hard way. I had to let half the staff go, and I did them one by one. It was like 41 people, and thought I was the most horrible human being on the planet because some of them screamed, some of them cried, some of them begged. It was awful. And I vowed I was never going to do that again because it was so horrible. We owed the phone company a small fortune, and they were going to shut the network down. And I called them and said, I don't know what to do. Let's work something out. And much to my great surprise, they were totally fantastically cool about working with us because they knew if they shut the thing down, they were never going to get any of it. And so we did a lot of things that were kind of contrarian. We raised prices. We increased our service offerings. We got the company back on its feet. I ran it for maybe 2.5 years, and then we sold that company. I worked for the buyer for a year as their CTO, left after my year was up. And then I had this brilliant idea. I decided I was going to get out of tech and I was going to be a pilot. So I took flying lessons and spent a bunch of money on renting planes. And I really loved it, but it was not my natural gift. I think it's safe to say that you wouldn't want me flying your family. And so after a few years of that and a lot of travel, I decided maybe I should get back into what I was good at. And that was about the time at which I decided, either I'm going to go work at a big tech company or I'm going to start something new. And I did. I did the interview loop. I spent a couple days on campus with Google. Almost joined big tech, but I don't know. Something said that I wouldn't fit and it wouldn't be right. And so instead I did the other thing. The original idea for Cascadeo was that somebody needed to represent the client. So back then, the IT infrastructure world, if you sold, let's say, Cisco networking equipment, you had customers who you were billing for your expertise and selling product to, but you also needed to meet your sales quota with the upstream vendor. And I thought, that's kind of a weird conflict of interest, because on one hand, the customer's paying you to do what's right for them, but on the other hand, you've got to please the larger company. And by the way, it's not just Cisco. That's how the whole VAR SI world works. So the original Cascadeo idea was simple. We're going to do exceptional network and systems engineering, and we are only going to represent the client. We are going to have no other master. Whatever is best for the client, that's what we're going to do. And we kind of thought of ourselves as something like a lawyer, right? So whoever we represent, our job is to make sure they are successful. And sometimes that means not buying equipment or not buying more licenses, which is almost always the answer when you go the traditional route. So that was 17 years ago. Obviously, the tech world has dramatically changed in that time. I mean, there's virtually nothing is the same as it was. Cloud was probably the single biggest disruptor during that period, and it's all we do today. We do nothing with physical infrastructure at all. And then more recently, within the last year, generative AI is even bigger. In the grand scheme of things, generative AI is the biggest invention of our lifetimes, and we haven't even scratch the surface of what's going to happen next with that. So that's where we're headed as a company.
Well, what's interesting about what you said is your intuition, which is so important in business. You listened to your intuition and it guided you to where you are today, instead of saying, well, I'm just going to follow the same path that everyone else does. I'm going to go work for big tech. I'm going to do this. Instead, you listen to yourself, and I commend you because it's allowed you to really have an impact.
I think I've done that. And more often than not, my intuition has been correct. There have been times when I have had intuitive fears that have proven to be understated. So, for example, I worked in the early internet backbone engineering world, and I kind of knew that there was some government wiretapping stuff going on. I kind of knew that there was probably more of it than people were aware of. My parents used to laugh and think that I was like the tinfoil hat conspiracy guy. And then the Snowden stuff came out.
Right.
And it was so much way worse than my worst case scenario was orders of magnitude off the mark as to the reality of what was happening. So I intuitively knew it, but you have some kind of a governor that tells you. Another one was Bitcoin, right? So when it first came out, I was like, this is really significant. From a computer science standpoint, this is a real invention. There's nothing that's before that has accomplished what this does in terms of like a distributed database and whatever else. And my gut said, this is important. You probably should place a bet here. But in this case, everyone around me said this is the most ridiculous thing ever. The only people that use it are drug dealers and pedophiles. Why would you, dirty your hands with this Bitcoin thing? And in that case, I did not listen to my instinct. And obviously, probably should have, because even though it's fallen a bit like in the last couple of days, it's still in the $20,000 to $30,000 a coin range. Whereas when it first came out, it was like some guy bought 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin, right? So
that's right.
But yeah, I do. I think, with cloud, when AWS first launched EC2, which is their compute on demand, instantly I knew that's what we should do. We were one of the very, very first adopters. We were one of the very first AWS partners. I think we were the very first managed services provider that Amazon certified globally. We helped them to build the audit for that. And yeah, I knew instinctively that cloud was going to be the future of everything because I had physically built data center and server for over a decade, and I knew that it was low value, miserable work that no one ever said thank you, but if it broke, people got really upset.
Exactly.
It's like being the power company.
Right.
You can't win.
No.
If you do your job, no one cares, and they grumble about the bill, but if you screw it up, people just lose their minds, right?
Exactly.
So cloud was one, and then generative AI, I can tell you the exact moment that the light bulb went on for me. We were at the AWS reInvent trade show last November. This is before ChatGPT came out.
Right.
And we were invited to co-present with two folks from Amazon. And one of them did a demo on stage with a product called Code Whisperer. And he said in natural language, I have a collection of photographs. I want you to take those photos, find all the photos that have pictures of cats in them, and then tell me all the features of those cats. Are they big? Are they small? Are they gray? Are they black? Are they white? Like, find the cats and tell me how many there are. Tell me which files have cats in them and tell me the features. And right on stage, it sat there and wrote the source code. Within a couple of seconds, he now had a working application on the open internet. He pointed it at a bucket full of photos, and it did exactly what he described. And there were audible gasps in the audience. Like, people couldn't believe it. And I was on stage going, is this a joke? Like, are you kidding me? Because I had never seen a computer program itself before. And then ChatGPT hit, and you know the rest of the story. I mean, things went completely crazy after that.
So in the news, I often read about cloud wars between AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and then an ecosystem of service companies like Cascadeo. Do the news articles have it right, Jared? I mean, what does the cloud wars look like on the ground for you?
I think there are different strengths and weaknesses to different platforms. They each have their own ecosystems. They each have their own kind of companies that are in their orbit that depend on them. So Cascadeo is very much heavy on AWS, in part because they have arguably the most comprehensive cloud platform, the broadest array of services. There's like over 200 of them now. In part, that's because it's what our customers tend to prefer. We tend to work with either tech-centric or tech-savvy or tech-aspirational companies, so they tend to be nerdier than average. They're not really corporate IT, which is usually a cost center. Typically, these are new products, new services, new lines of business, new revenue, so it's seen as an investment in the future rather than as something to cram down. I will say Azure has come a long way. In the early days, I would say it was a little rough around the edges, but they have made tremendous strides with that, and they've done very well with Office 365, which is the Word, Excel, PowerPoint suite that you know turned into software as a service, so it's web accessible now as well as the desktop app. They've done very well with that. And Microsoft has a great ecosystem of partner companies that have been long-standing Microsoft resellers, and they build on top of Microsoft technology stack. So I think they've done they've done a couple of brilliant things. They've managed to make the transition from a box software company to a cloud company. They've managed to keep their whole developer and reseller ecosystem intact and happy. And they have made two of the most spectacularly brilliant acquisitions in the cloud industry. One of them was GitHub, and the other one, this is a little bit random, but LinkedIn. And if you take those two data sets and you combine them and you think about the visibility that you have into what people are working on, are they growing? Are they developing? Are they innovating? How many developers do they have? What languages are they using? You can infer so much. Who are they working with? Who are they not working with? Are they hiring? Are they firing? Those data sets, there's only one of those in the world. And then, of course, their pick with OpenAI was, a game changer. And they've publicly announced they're going to integrate that into every aspect of their products, cloud and otherwise. So I think Microsoft has played it really well. Google has found a good niche in data sciences and analytics. They're very good for very large scale, like if you're a genomics company or oil and gas company and you do very large scale data analytics work, Google is usually the most cost effective. And when they see something they want, like a specific customer, they're very aggressive at going after it. Similarly, Oracle has actually done reasonably well because they have such a large installed base. And I think their strategy seems to be, if you're already an Oracle customer, we're going to make it a no-brainer for you to go to Oracle Cloud. And if you go the other way, it's going to cost you. So all of them have different strategies and strengths and weaknesses. One thing that has changed across the board, in the early days of cloud, it was seen as a land grab. The cloud providers wanted to win the business, and they wanted all of it. And they promoted this thing called lift and shift. Mm-hmm. And the idea there was to take all of the virtualized servers out of the data center, copy them over the wire, put them into, pick a cloud, and get them to work as they did. And now, voila, you're in the cloud. But as it turns out, that's not really cloud computing, that's just hosting, right? And it ends up being very bad for the customer. It's very expensive. It's not materially better. You don't have to maintain the hardware, but you really don't get the benefits out of cloud unless you build on the platform. And all the platforms are different. They're not compatible. And when you hear about multi-cloud, like people that try to hedge their bets and maintain platform neutrality, they end up foregoing the incredible benefits that you get by picking one. And it really almost doesn't matter which one you pick. Pick one that's good for your business, right? But pick one and go deep on it. Become experts at it. Go as high up the platform stack as you can, because that's where the value is. It's not in hosting yesterday's Windows server. It's getting rid of it completely and replacing it with serverless or with managed components like managed database. So the cloud wars, I think it's more like cloud factions. Okay. But I don't see it as an active hot war. No one's lobbing missiles at each other. And there are legitimate reasons for customers to pick different platforms. Just as I mentioned, I mean, the bulk of what we do by a long shot is with AWS. And from a computer science standpoint, I do believe that they have overall the best platform. But that's not to say that there aren't merits to the other ones. I just think that by default, it's the one we would typically go with.
So for those who have never worked in a large company environment with large, complicated IT, it's hard to imagine just how expensive and time-consuming it is to transform from mainframes or on-premises databases into the cloud. Can you give a bit more flavor to the audience, to the kinds of services Cascadeo offers and are value added to your customers, especially around AI?
Sure. So we do four things, essentially. We have a professional services business that helps companies ideally transform to cloud native as opposed to migrate existing workloads, because again, that's not really cloud. It might be a stepping stone, but it's not really the end game. So cloud done right to us is platform adoption and modernizing or building net new. We have a managed services business, which is the largest part of our company. And the managed services business does 24/7 monitoring, care and feeding. We do quarterly business reviews. We help with security, with cost optimization, kind of trusted advisor, mentor, and we provide service level agreements so customers have some upper bound on response time and they're not on the hook operationally all hours of the day and night. We have a resale business where if you want, we can resell AWS services to you. There are reasons why you might want to do that. There are also reasons why you might want to buy direct from Amazon. We support both models. And then we have our software product, which is the newest part of the company. It's software as a service. And the idea there is to take all of the events that come out of all of these IT systems and cloud platforms and to feed them into generative AI and to have different AI platforms analyze those events, try to figure out what they mean, what their business impact is, what the likely root causes are, what, if anything, should be done about them, and then try to write a runbook recipe that says, when you see this thing happen, here's what it means, here's what you should do or not do, here are the procedures that you would follow in response to this. Now, a lot of events are neutral. You don't do anything with them. Some of them are positive events, but usually as a managed services provider, we are tasked with dealing with negative events. So something is failing or about to fail, or there's a cost overrun, or something is slower than it should be. And it turns out that the generative AI tools, which are trained on the whole body of work that is the internet, do an incredibly good job at analyzing, interpreting, and synthesizing what to do. So before there was generative AI, an event would come in, a tier one engineer would receive it, validate it, probably escalate it if it was serious. A tier two engineer would pull out the run book for that customer and look for the page that sort of matched that event and hopefully got it right. They would either follow the script, or if they didn't have confidence or couldn't find a match, they would escalate it to tier three, where a senior engineer would come online and try to fix the problem. And that whole process takes time, and it's not deterministic and perfectly repeatable because there's a series of human decisions in the mix there. Most IT outages, as it turns out, 80% of the time is that initial triage, troubleshooting, escalation, deciding what to do or what not to do, gaining approvals, gaining access. Only 20% of the outage is actual remediation. And what we found is that by leveraging generative AI, we're able to compress that 80% dramatically and go from some signal comes in to here is what to do about it with an extremely high degree of confidence and accuracy in a few seconds. And it costs a few pennies because the cost of generative AI is so spectacularly low. Now, do you still need a human on the loop? Of course. You can't just turn it all over and hope that the airplane will fly itself perfectly with no pilot in the pilot seat. But the larger the airplane, the more automated it is, and the more the pilot's job and the first officer's job is to supervise the performance of these automations and systems and to make sure that they do the correct thing and to compensate when they don't. But this is kind of counterintuitive. The smaller the plane, the less automation you have, the more pilot workload there is. It's much harder to fly a Cessna 172 four-seater than it is to fly, a 777, right? And people would think it's exactly the opposite, but because those systems are so incredibly automated and there's so much redundancy, the pilot workload typically on light aircraft is the worst case scenario, and it's a great way to learn. But if you're not wired for constant multitasking and a million different inputs and random things happening asynchronously, it can be overwhelming very quickly. So generative AI for us is used internally. It's used externally for customers. We expose these runbooks to our customers. We license this to other companies like ours that have other managed services businesses. And then going forward, because we are the professional and managed services provider to enterprise customers, typically, we aim to be their partner in leveraging generative AI in ways that benefit their business. And there's a whole range of things you can do with generative AI. It's not just programmatic operations. It's not just code generation, like automated software creation. You've seen the magic you can do with creating images that are photorealistic, even crazy things like creating poetry and music. It's remarkably good. And this is the first real generation of this technology. It's only going to get better. A real world use case that we see a lot these days is copywriting. So what humans used to spend a lot of time manually writing and editing, you can do 10 times the work of an ordinary human and become sort of Superman-like. Because generative AI, it's not going to replace you, but it's a force multiplier that lets you accomplish so much more work in so much less time. And it often will nudge you or remind you of things that you might have forgotten or overlooked, or even things that you didn't know to ask. So it's not just that it's faster and cheaper, it's actually better because it has a broader base of knowledge and it's less prone to overlook things accidentally in the way that even a really smart, competent, experienced human might. So I believe that the future of our business largely will be centered around generative AI. It'll be much less infrastructure oriented, much less application oriented, and much more about extracting value from the data that is unique to that company and helping them find ways to gain advantage using that data. And that is true in any industry, soup to nuts, except maybe the local barber shop. Any industry that relies on data and information and workflows that typically are either automated or human-driven, generative AI is going to change all of that, and it's going to happen very, very quickly.
So you were senior technical advisor on the HBO comedy Silicon Valley. How did you find yourself in that role? And share some of the stories, the fun stories that about making sure everything looked and sounded authentic on the show.
Yeah, that was actually one of the most interesting and fun things I've ever worked on. The genius behind the show is a legend in the IT industry. This is Mike Judge. He did Office Space, which in the IT world is considered, the best kind of parody or comedy movie ever. It's so spot on. It's eerie. It could only have been written by somebody who had worked in the IT world. There's so many inside jokes and one-liners. It's crazy, right? He also did Beavis and Butthead. He did Idiocracy. So he's a living legend in the nerd world. A mutual connection introduced me to one of the producers. And the reason for this was that I had experience building infrastructure in unusual places. This dates back to the dial-up internet era. We had modem banks for dial-up in gas stations, in churches, in people's garages, anywhere we could find a suitable environment, because they had to be local, right? You needed a local phone number to dial into. And we needed a lot of power, a lot of cooling. We needed hundreds of phone lines, which back then were copper. So we had all these requirements. We had to have a high bandwidth uplink to the internet. So I was selected because I had this specific narrow experience building and operating real, complex infrastructure in very unusual places. In the show, they very deliberately decide not to go with cloud and instead decide to build their own data center in the garage of the house. And so my primary area of focus was making sure that every detail of the data center in the garage was as correct as possible. They were meticulous about every little detail, even the Post-it notes and the whiteboards in the background. Everything had to be true and correct and believable, because people would sit there and freeze frame it and then find one little flaw and go on Reddit and rip it apart. So they were extremely conscious and conscientious in every regard. And they had an army of subject matter experts, like VPs from big tech companies all over the place, that knew one very narrow thing, like video compression, for example. They wanted there to be no wiggle room or room for someone to poke holes in it and say, this is crap. It's, you got it all wrong. It's a fantasy. It was very important that it be as true and real as possible. So one idea that we kicked around was, they're on a budget. They've got this weird space. They need sort of ruggedized equipment. It's not a clean room data center with proper air conditioning. What analog exists in the real world? And I thought, Bitcoin miners. So people would take milk crates and put mining equipment in these plastic milk crates, open air for ventilation and for heat dissipation. And these things aged out quickly as new hardware came online. So there was tons of this stuff. So I said, why don't we go buy up a bunch of old Bitcoin mining equipment? Another one was, what do you expect to see when there's a data center, whether it's in a garage or in a room? And one of the answers is a lot of blinking lights. And so we thought a lot about what kinds of lights, how many of them? Do they all blink together? Do they do clever blinking pattern? Like that level of detail. The highlight of it for me was spending time on the set, watching how the magic got made. Because it was a big budget. This was not like, a couple of dudes. This was a big budget, full production, like movie scale production thing. And watching how they would pick up this entire crew and cafeteria and all this equipment and generators and camera crews and hundreds of people, and literally like a beautifully orchestrated, symphony, they could move this whole thing, tear it all down, set it all up, do the shoot, tear it all down. And it was just magic to me to watch it. I also got to meet some of the actors from the show, and that was really special because they're all famous comedians. So all of the characters in the show are comics, and they're all also really, really smart, like technically. So meeting people that were brilliant from a technology standpoint and really funny and personable was great. It was a wonderful experience. And at the end, they sent me a check, and I never cashed it because I wanted to keep it. So I have the check hanging on my wall. It's probably no longer good for deposit, right. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't hand it over to the bank because it was just too good of a sentimental thing for me. So
that's fantastic. So in the Silicon Valley show, in the first few seasons, they're focusing on landing big VC funding.
Yep.
From your entrepreneurial career, do you remember your first big deal you landed?
Oh boy. I think the first big deal we landed was selling the dial-up ISP, Oz.net. We had a couple of different buyers lined up. We had kind of an auction process going. We struggled greatly with who the right fit was. Some of them offered more cash. Some of them felt like a better cultural fit. Some of them were more entrepreneurial. Some of them were more like, I don't care if I'm selling toilets, I just want to make money. And this is one where we followed our gut and went with a company that we felt was similar in terms of values and culture and love of the internet. It felt like they were like-minded people. And indeed they were. The River, which was the Arizona company, was an early dial-up ISP that was reasonably successful. And we chose them specifically because we felt like kindred spirits. So it turns out there were better financial deals that we could have taken, but there was not a better fit for our people, for our customers, for us as the people that were going to carry the work forward. And so that was a decision that was made not purely for financial reasons. It was also because we believed that we would do big things together and that we were better together. So I think that would be my first big deal.
And that's a good point. When I did my first deal back in the early 90s, I bought an industrial building and we syndicated it. And it was the same thought process. We wanted to bring in investors and we were hungry for investors. You know, this was 95,000 square feet. It was millions of dollars. We were young. And what ended up happening was I wanted to align ourselves with accredited investors that really could sustain with us and had similar values. Mm-hmm. And that way we can grow. And so we went out to raise equity, which it was all shoe leather when back in the early 90s. You know, you throw on the suit and you go and you give your pitch and it was a little bit different than a VC. It was more individual investors going and investing with you and believing in you. As a young man without a track record, it was a challenge, but we got it done. And it was more like who believes in a young guy who's growing in the business to come into it. So aligning yourself with great people is so important with similar values, and because you don't want issues in your deals or your investments or your business. And so we've learned at a young age, especially in commercial real estate, how important it is to have people that are going to support you and uplift you to help you grow instead of criticizing you of, hey, I gotcha, or you're not doing this right, or the criticism or the judgment. And so it's such a great point. How do you think about tech investing at this stage in your career? I mean, what's your approach for deciding on what smaller stage tech companies get involved with, whether as an investor, an advisor, or a board member?
I think there are an overwhelming number of companies that kind of do the Me Too thing. So right now, generative AI is the hot topic, and there's a flood of money flowing into 1,000 different startups that all claim to have some slightly unique bent on it. And there are always going to be diamonds in there, but you've got to really dig for them because a lot of it is not sufficiently differentiated. The number of really dramatic innovations, disruptive innovations, is actually pretty small. And obviously, everybody's trying to find them. I think for us, one thing that I've learned the hard way and that any VC will tell you is you do not want a huge number, especially of relatively unsophisticated investors. Most VCs, if they see a cap table with like 50 individuals on it, they won't touch it because the odds are too high that one or more of those 50 are going to be problematic. Mm-hmm. So they tend to like a very small number of investors of high caliber who they believe are going to be cooperative and collaborative and not sort of in it for themselves as opposed to looking at the bigger picture and trying to win. So that's very important. It's not just, is there money or money to be made? It's who are you working with? Because I've seen great companies implode and I've seen relatively crap companies do really well because of the people. So one thing I've heard from VCs a lot over the years, they would rather have an A team with a B idea than a B team with an A idea. Mm-hmm. Because it's a cliche, but it's true. The people really do make all the difference. And it only takes one bad actor to cause such immense damage, especially given the way our legal system works in this country. A single bad actor can cause literally the destruction of an entire company. I mean, the power imbalance between the business and the individual has become so extreme. And the way that the legal system works, where there are attorneys that will take things on contingency, for example, where there's really no skin in the game. And so there are bad actors that will, every time they get bumped in their car, immediately claim whiplash and go call an attorney, right? And that exists in the business world too. It's not common. It's not even a significant minority, but they are out there. And you don't always know who they are, right? Sometimes they are the people that appear to be nice or friendly or helpful, but when the opportunity presents itself, they are willing to harm others because it is in the moment better for them. And you have to be really careful of that, because tech is a high stakes game and there's not a lot of margin for error, and it moves very, very quickly. And if you are distracted or derailed by the wrong investor, the wrong partner, that can turn a golden opportunity into a complete flame out, no matter how good the technology is, no matter how good everything else might be. And that's happened over and over and over again throughout the history of tech. And because tech moves so fast, because there's so much competitive pressure, you really have to get everything right all the time. There really isn't a lot of margin for error.
Yeah, and in commercial real estate, when we look at investments, we do a tremendous amount of due diligence. But it's also how good are your people running these investments, we found. And it's like if you have a leadership team and there's one leader that just is not pulling their weight, or they're causing toxicity, which is a big word out there, or confusion, or not showing up or being present, it causes chaos. Because in our business, in commercial real estate investing, one of the things we're very careful of is everyone contributes to the team. And if you have one team member that's not pulling their weight or not showing up or not living up to our core values, which is transparency, integrity, consistency, and expertise, it causes so much chaos and it starts bleeding through departments. And so it's such a great point, Jared, you bring up. It's people are everything in life, and who you surround yourself is so important. As you grow as people, really look at your inner circle and say, who am I surrounding myself? Show me your friends, I'll show you your future. And it's no difference in business. In business is, it's one of the toughest things is hiring great employees out there, is finding the right, not only, I would take an employee where maybe they're, like you said, a B player, but they help create an A community within the company. And so in your career, what would you say are the biggest risks you've taken, whether personal or financial?
Well, starting a company, obviously, was not a small one, especially when, I had good opportunities in industry. Big tech companies pay really well, and there is an opportunity cost to not taking, it's not just the cash comp, it's the equity side of it, right? Doing the deal with the river was a big risk because they were smaller and not as well funded, and they didn't have a big pile of cash to just shovel over the line. That was a partially seller finance deal, so there was some risk there. Trying to leave tech and become a pilot was a risk that incurred some real hard cost and opportunity cost and taught me a lot. Can't say I have anything to show for it other than a expired pilot's license, but I learned so much about myself and about systems and about process and procedure and about dealing with constant multiple inputs. Most technology is very linear, right? You're dealing with one thing at a time. You work on it, you set it aside, you work on the next thing. Flying an airplane is a totally different thing, right? There's just stuff happening. And unlike a car, if the car catches on fire, you can pull over to the side of the road and jump out. It doesn't work that way with a plane. Rule number one, you have to fly the airplane. No matter what the hell else is going on, if you stop flying the airplane, you're going to die quickly. And so even though that one, I can't say that the math was great on it. God, I learned so much about so many different things. And I was so impressed with how the aviation world has taken every single accident that's ever happened and meticulously studied it and understood exactly the contributing factors, the series of decisions, the series of actions, and the outcomes. And the reason that it's now the safest form of transport is because they have this rigor, right? There's this rigor about when something does go wrong. It's not like, oh, well, the plane crashed. There's always a meticulous reconstruction and investigation. If you ever read the NTSB reports, they're fascinating because of the level of detail, right? And one of the ways that they have achieved the level of safety and reliability that they have is through the use of checklists. And every stage of flight, before you do the takeoff roll, the climb out, cruise flight, getting set up for landing, all of these things, there's a checklist. And the pilot and the first officer recite the steps out loud for the cockpit voice recorder, but also to make sure that they're constantly in sync and they're both on the same page about the status of the airplane, the status of the flight, the decisions that are being made. And that actually, to me, I think about that all the time. So was that a great financial decision? No. But was it a great form of education that differs from university, computer science, or industry experience? Yeah. And would I do it again? Absolutely. Money well spent.
Yeah, it's growth. And that's what life's about, is how do you continue to grow and learn? And I'm sure there was experiences when you were a pilot that you can transform into business. Because one thing about the airlines I think is brilliant is, and no one talks about, is how systematic and programmatic they are. It's like when you get off a plane, the cleaning crew's on in 2 seconds. That's why the airline business to me is fascinating, because the systems that they have in place to prevent problems is incredible. That the plane almost flies itself because of the systems that are in place on these airlines. I think it's brilliant. In my business, we're incorporating systems constantly in our business to be able to shield against problems. And it goes back to, like in my business, when I look at it, we've gone from different asset classes, expanding asset classes. When we got into the medical office investing space, it was criticized. People thought we were going into socialist medicine. Like, why would you buy healthcare? This country can't support Social Security. How are we going to support some of the programs out there that need to be funded, whether it's dialysis or other type of government-funded programs in the medical office space? And so we looked at it and we said the human body is never going out of style.
That's right.
It will never go out of style. It's a great investment. So we took the risk and said, we're going to double down on investing in medical office. That opened the door to veterinarian office, because now more people have pets and things evolve. And so I've learned in my career is sometimes you have to go against the naysayers and open your eyes and say, what's reality? What's really going on here where I can put money into and time into that I know will be successful? And we looked at the human body and said, people always need medical services. Till the day we're in the ground, it will always be that case. And that's when medical office at Alliance, my company, blossomed almost 2 decades ago as one of our niches. That's probably a majority of our portfolio now. And so that was a risk. One of the risks I had is we got out of the central region of the United States when the internet became prevalent. And we said, you know what, we're going to start investing down south and out west in different areas. And then I got to travel at all these places. And so I had to learn, like, okay, the different cultures, different cities, how to travel, how to stay, how to protect myself. And so how you manage risk in business is so important in life. And I think that's why in business you see people become greater and more successful as they age because of the experiences they go through, just like you did being a pilot. You know, those experiences you went through will help you in business. And how do we systematize this process? How do we deal with people? How do we deal with challenges maybe that arise that weren't expected? And how you become solutionary oriented as business is so important.
Absolutely. By the way, I think the healthcare bent is actually much more visionary than you're giving yourself credit for. If you look at the amount of money and brain power that the Silicon Valley crowd are investing in longevity research and in ways to slow or reverse aging, if you consider the inevitable impact of generative AI on drug development, on innovations in healthcare. We are entering the golden age for healthcare, right? The rate of progress, the wealth creation, the opportunity there has never been better. So whether we trend towards socialized healthcare or not, we have the greatest healthcare innovation machine in the history of the world. Look at what we did during the pandemic. Look at how quickly they were able to develop, test, and mass produce mRNA vaccines that previously had never been produced at scale, had only ever been done in the lab. And we saved tens of millions of lives and trillions of dollars in further economic damage because we have that industry. So I'm personally of the mind that all things related to health, longevity, treatment, long-term care, all of those things, no matter what happens with the trend towards socialized healthcare or not, all of those things are massive opportunities that are going to continue to develop faster and faster, with generative AI being perhaps the biggest driver over the next 10 years. For example, they've already been able to predict like every single protein that could possibly exist. They've already generated candidate drugs that humans would never have thought of. And again, we're just in the very beginning stages of this technology. And as we improve the technology and as we build larger data sets and better models, and as more capital flows into this technology, things that are cutting edge today will seem primitive in 10 years' time. I think human life expectancy within our lifetimes will certainly exceed 100. Ray Kurzweil, who's one of my favorite futurists, has this thing, he's going to live long enough to live forever, right? If you can just buy yourself another 10 or 20 years, right, the technology will buy you more runway. And I might not make it, but my kids might well have a chance at not immortality, because eventually you get hit by a bus, right? But in terms of treatable causes of death, heart disease, cancer, that I truly believe that we've just scratched the surface of what's possible. So I'm not a real estate expert, but all things relating to healthcare and the body and treatment seem to me like there's only one direction they can head, and that is up.
And that's why our new fund, the Alliance Medical Property Fund, is doing so well. Because investors see that if I can diversify my capital into assets and businesses that are the foundation of the human body, makes a lot of sense for consistent cash flow and profits. So I heard through a friend of mine, Jared, some of your parenting advice, which I love. You mentioned she said she mentioned to your kids that they should focus on finding their passion and not waiting for a big inheritance, which for the Reinberg kids out there, if you're listening, this is really important. Share more about how you came to this piece of wisdom.
Yeah. So I have what I think of as the give a shit factor. Okay. And by this, I mean, I actually think it's fine to choose a less lucrative or prestigious career if you truly give a shit about it. So what if one of my kids wanted to be a chef or a professional musician or an artist? A lot of kids fantasize about being a professional baseball player. I would rather see passion and commitment and hard work and falling down and picking yourself back up. Do I think that making a lot of money is the most important thing? No. I mean, money's great, but they've proven this. Beyond a certain amount, it's a diminishing returns thing, right? If you have too little money, life is very hard and uncomfortable. But I think the number that I've heard, probably not including the coastal cities, is if you make like north of $70,000 a year, your level of happiness doesn't really go up that much, even if you make way more than that. And so do I want my kids to, be starving artists? No. But if their heart and their passion is in art, I would want them to go to the best possible art school, study with the best artists, and put their heart into it, and wake up every day and love what they do, because life is short. And slogging through a job that you hate just because it pays well kind of misses the point of it, right? I mean, You can look at your bank account balance and you can look at the fancy cars in your driveway. And if you wake up every morning feeling that dread, that God, do I have to do this again? Am I really going to, when does it end? Those are toxic things that I think, back to the healthcare thing, I think they take a real toll, not just psychologically. I think they cause you to have poor eating habits, maybe to drink, maybe to not exercise, maybe to not do things that bring you joy. Like for me, I love skiing, right? I love it more than anything. And every chance I get to go skiing, I take it. Is there an opportunity cost to taking a day away from work and going skiing? Yes. Do I think that I am better the next day at what I do for a living because I went skiing? Absolutely. So I personally place a very high value in, it's not exactly happiness and it's not the pursuit of pleasure. It's just wanting to do what you do day to day. And with very few exceptions in my life, the things that I do day to day for work are things that I find interesting and challenging, and I feel like I'm being productive and helping people. And I've had many times when I've thought, if I had gone to work for mega tech company X, I probably would have made a lot more money because look at the share price.
Right.
But would I have been happier? And would I have been more present with my kids when they're young? Would I have had all of the crazy misadventures that I've had? It would have been easier, but I don't think that it would have been better. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about my kids and when I talk to them, I want them to give a shit about something, and it almost doesn't matter what it is. It's the act of giving a shit and putting your heart into it and really being passionate about it. The money will follow. If you're good at something and you're consistent with it, you can usually find a way to make a living at it. And maybe the most important thing isn't making a lot of money. It's making enough money to live the life that you want to live. Mm-hmm. And to me, for example, I'm acutely aware of the fact that my kids are growing up. And I think a lot about this window of opportunity that I have to spend time with them, because that's a rapidly contracting window. You can always make money later. Right. There's always another job. There's always more money to be made. That's one of the great things about America, right? Uh-huh. You're never going to look around and go, well, what do I do now? I don't know. There's nothing left to do. There's always new opportunity here.
Right.
But there are certain things that, you have a brief window, and your childhood is one of them. Your children's childhood is one of them. So I want my kids to care. My daughter loves art. She's really into art. And it makes me so happy to see her passionate about art. I am not an artist. I am terrible at art. I know nothing about art. Mm-hmm. I don't buy it. I don't produce it. I don't even really appreciate it that much.
Right.
But seeing how excited it makes her and how many hours she can spend and how happy it makes her to produce art, be an artist, please.
Love it.
Understand that may not be the easiest life, and that if, driving a Bentley is important to you, maybe don't be an artist.
That's right.
Or be exceptional at it and get really lucky. But is it really that important to drive a Bentley? I don't think it is. I've had nice cars. I've had cheap cars. They're still cars.
So, Jared, you were involved in the Seattle Internet Exchange. Share more about the organization's mission and why it's an important cause.
So this is actually one of the things that I am most proud of and can probably take the least credit for personally. So here's the backstory. So in the early dial-up internet days, in Seattle, there's this building that is kind of the nexus of all the telecom infrastructure. These are called carrier hotels. And the entire Pacific Northwest, all of the fiber optics and copper wires kind of converge in this one building. As a result of this, all of the internet service providers had major infrastructure there because that was where the connectivity was. And two of them found that despite being like one floor apart, their network traffic was going from Seattle to San Francisco and back. And even in fiber optics, you're traveling at like 1/10 the speed of light, it turns out that latency matters. And it's also not free. It's not free to move data around. And so I think the original first iteration was an Ethernet switch that these two companies plugged into. And then there was a third company that said, hey, I want to do that too. And then there was a fourth. And it was a completely grassroots, unplanned serendipity. It just happened. So more people started connecting, more companies started connecting. We had donations from major tech companies because they wanted to see it flourish. We had major equipment manufacturers who wanted to donate to showcase their networking equipment because this is a very high criticality, very complicated, high traffic. It's not a usual use case, right? It's not a data center or an office. And at some point, we realized that it had become a critical infrastructure asset. And we were concerned that it might be seen as part of the commercial real estate building that housed it. And so we decided that to keep it pure and nonprofit and member-led, that we would form a nonprofit. And so I actually was heavily involved with hiring an attorney and forming a nonprofit corporation, incorporating that. And I was one of the founding board members and served on the board and as the president and as an advisor for about 20 years. And during that time, a lot of amazing things have happened. So there are now, I think, over 350 distinct entities, ranging from internet service providers, content providers, cloud providers, submarine cable networks, offshoots into distant states. The exchange has decentralized, so it's no longer just in one building. It covers the entire metro area, and there are actually offshoots that go much further outside of Seattle now. It's interconnected with a commercial exchange that is also in Seattle, so if you're at one, you kind of have access to the other. And perhaps most importantly, it has become the template for how to build nonprofit internet exchange points all around the world. One of the people that was originally involved was very passionate about radical transparency. And every single decision, financial statement, everything is wide open and for the world to see. And it's licensed in a way that encourages other people to take it and run with it. And what we've seen happen, and this was not something I expected, is that other people in other cities around the world said, hey, we need a local internet exchange too. Let's go ahead and find one that's successful, grassroots style, and let's do it. And the early work we did, building, incorporating, building the governance model, building the operating model, the decision-making process, the explicit decision to narrow the scope to moving bits as efficiently and inexpensively as possible to the exclusion of everything else. Those decisions ended up becoming kind of the industry best practices and document templates. And now, if you're in a developing country and you want to start an IX, the default thing to do is to go take all the 6 materials and scrub out Seattle and put your name of your town in there and go file them and call it done. And so it sort of led to this wonderful contribution, I guess, to the internet as a whole that I certainly didn't expect or think about at the time. We were just trying to solve a problem, which was connectivity in Seattle at that point was not great. Everything got backhauled to Bay Area because that was the nexus back then. There were these things called the NAPs. I think there were network access points where they were kind of like the mega hubs that all of the networks tied into. There was May East and May West, right? They were these 2 gigantic exchange points. And that was a terrible model. Think of imagine the airline hub and spoke model, except there's only 2 hubs, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. Right. That does not work, right? And over time, we have, private exchange points where you can pay an operator. You have public ones like the 6 where you can just plug in and go and you can peer with anybody that wants to peer with you. And then, of course, if you're a very high bandwidth mover, you can do private interconnects. So if you're Netflix, for example, and a lot of your customers use Comcast, you might do a direct interconnect between those two networks and bypass the exchanges entirely, because that's more efficient at moving the traffic from A to B than going through an exchange point. So the 6 now has, I want to say, over 350 active members. It's completely member-led. It has a very healthy cash reserve for future switching needs. It operates without any recurring charges. So there are, if you buy a very high capacity port, there's a one-time port fee, but we don't charge a monthly recurring cost to be a participant. It runs very, very lean, almost all volunteer. There is one full-time engineer who's kind of the operations expert, and there's really nothing else like it in the world. There are other free exchange points. None of them have reached that scale and criticality. And at some point, I think after about 20 years, I said, you know what? This kid's all grown up and I have nothing left to contribute. And I kind of backed out. And now I sit back and watch, and I'm really proud of where it's gone. And there's a new generation of people that have taken it and run with it. And it's going to be there forever. It's now a permanent part of the internet backbone. And it will only continue to grow because there's never enough bandwidth, right? And as we move into the era of augmented reality, of virtual reality, of 4K, 8K, super high def, eventually 3D immersive experiences, the bandwidth demands will continue to grow exponentially. It's not a linear growth function. In fact, if you look at the website for the Seattle Internet Exchange, we plot over time the bandwidth growth. And when you look at the graph, it looks like a perfectly linear straight line graph. But then when you look at the y-axis, you realize it's not linear, right? It's literally a perfect exponential growth curve. Yeah. And it's so perfect that you can't believe that it's real. And that is the nature of bandwidth. That's the nature of computing, of storage, of all things, right? Every time we invent more powerful networks or computers or cameras or storage medium, the technology always rises to meet it. The counterpart to that is there's a joke that's no matter how much money you make, somehow magically your expenses always rise to meet it, right? And it's definitely true of bandwidth. There's never enough bandwidth. And it's hard to believe today's iPhone has more bandwidth than the entire internet did in the early dial-up days. There's more bandwidth between your iPhone and the cell tower than the entire network combined. When I first got started, a extremely high capacity, high bandwidth circuit was called a T1, and it was 1.544 megabits per second, which today is unbearably slow, unimaginably slow. It's not as bad as dial-up, but it would be unusable by today's standards. And we had thousands and thousands of users sharing one of those because the cost of it was so high and the scarcity of it was so high. And part of the reason that we built the 6 was to increase capacity locally in the Seattle area and to avoid hyper consolidation by a few large telecom companies, which was the internet at that point. There were only a few, like there was Sprint and MCI, and there was only a few companies you could buy these high capacity circuits from. So the 6 was built out of necessity. It was built by some of the smartest people I've ever met and worked with, all of whom have gone on to do big things in the industry. They're all entrepreneurial. Some of them have had spectacular exits. Some of them work at, some of the leading companies like Netflix and are their senior most backbone engineers. So that group of people, the early backbone community in Seattle, it was one of those special serendipitous, like people with a common passion, common interest, common need. No one was getting paid for this. We just did it because it was cool and it was working. And the more we did it, the more people said, hey, this is great. Let me help too. Let me donate time, energy, materials, equipment. And when the big companies like Microsoft and Amazon and Netflix took notice, it went to the next level because it was ultimately in their best interest to have a free exchange point with good connectivity. And now it's literally, we have offshoots all the way across the Pacific, all the way into Asia. I mean, it's gotten that big. So
that's fantastic. In your career, you built a lot of products and been on the ground floor with some of today's big technologies. Do you have a FOMO list of areas you wish you could have a company doing? Like, for example, electric cars, Web3, SpaceX, nuclear fission. If you had the time now.
I regret deeply not following my gut on Bitcoin because I knew from a computer science standpoint, that it was a real innovation. I didn't know if it was going to work in terms of as a currency or as a store of value, but the blockchain as a technology is a legitimate, massive innovation. No one has ever cracked that nut before. So I guess I am sad about that. I was a very early EV adopter and have never regretted that. I've had 3 EVs and I have 3 cars today. I have a very, very, very high maintenance diesel powered SUV that every time I turn it on, I fear the check engine light will come on. I have a very high mileage gasoline powered Lexus Toyota product that never fails, but still burns a lot of gas and stinks and requires oil changes. And then I have an EV that without fail just works. And you take 2,000 moving parts in a modern, high-end internal combustion engine drivetrain and reduce it to 20, right? Like it's orders of magnitude simpler. And I don't know how people don't see this. It's so obvious to me that combustion engines are it's a dead end technology, right? It'll be a collector thing for hobbyists like vintage Porsches, right? It's not going to be a mainstream thing in 10 or 20 years. So I don't have FOMO about that. I don't have any FOMO about the kind of Web3 NFT thing because I never really believed in that. I've never been super big on the idea of like NFTs as a store of value. I've always kind of thought that was bunk. And clearly it was a massive bubble with the Bored Ape thing and whatever. So no part of me regrets that. I have always been a passionate believer in fission, and I've always been baffled and horribly saddened by the lack of leadership around the deployment of proven safe fission reactor designs. When you look at, we now have wildfire season in Washington State. We never had that when I was a kid. Everyone's buying an air conditioner. We never had that. We never even needed them. We never even thought about it. Why would you need an air conditioner in Washington? It rains all the time.
Exactly.
We have air purifiers, HEPA filters all over because the smoke gets so bad. And then, of course, there's the tragedy in Hawaii, right? And so, to me, the failure, we've had 40 years of notice about what was going to happen and what timeline it was going to happen on. And the failure of leadership around fission, the failure to mass deploy fission reactors to displace primarily coal, but even natural gas turbines, I think that's unforgivable. I think this is an example of, there's a joke. Politicians love coal because it kills millions of people very slowly. They hate nuclear because it kills a few thousand very quickly. And so because it's easier to kick the can down the road, because there's a few shrill screaming voices that are anti-nuclear, because there's an occasional incident that is contained to a small geographic area that we can learn from, just like we did with aviation, that we can make improvements to the processes around, just like we did with aviation. We have done exactly the opposite thing that we should have done. We have been actively decommissioning nuclear reactors and building more natural gas, coal, what have you. And the world is like literally burning, and no one's even talking about this. You hear occasionally, well, there's some little startup working on like small modular nuclear reactors, and there is some real evidence that there may be progress on the fusion side, which if it were true and deployable at scale would be the biggest thing ever. But will it happen quickly enough? I don't think we can afford to wait. Like if I were president for a day, the very first thing I would do, very first act would be, I want the Defense Production Act, a Manhattan Project. We are going to build a couple hundred fission reactors using a proven design that we know is stable and safe, and we know how to build it and operate it. And we are going to do that faster than ever. We are going to cut the red tape. We're not going to have 10 years of litigation and environmental reviews. We're not going to have 500 community meetings to sit here and talk about how it can't be in my backyard, because we are out of time. Like, we have waited way too long. And at this point, unfortunately, love it or hate it, there is no other technology that scales quickly enough to produce enough power. There's no alternative. And no one's even talking about it. And I had really thought that by now, someone would have stood up and said, you know what, this is a tough call, and we wish that it didn't have to go down this way, but we can't stop consuming electricity and energy. We're not going to stop those things. Like, you can't ask people to do that because they're not going to. So if you accept that you can't cut the demand and that demand will only continue to grow, you shift the problem to, okay, well, how do we increase and diversify the supply? And yes, wind is great. And yes, solar is great. And I believe we should be working on geothermal. And I love hydroelectric. But the reality is the amount of energy that we need to produce to sustain the way of living and the population that we have today, there is only one alternative to burning stuff, and that is fission. Why the hell are we not building fission reactors by the dozen?
So well said. It's true. And so before we wrap up, are there any ventures you have in the pipeline or causes you're involved with that you want to share with the audience?
Well, obviously, I'm very passionate about clean energy, about nuclear, about EVs. To me, that's among the most important things. I love to see the advances in battery chemistry and technology. In fact, you had a guest recently. I listened to one of your episodes, and I loved hearing, about ways to make that technology better, faster, cheaper. Mm-hmm. I loved the comment that he made. He was really interesting, by the way, about how these things are like 80 or 90% recyclable.
That's right.
Oil is 0% recyclable. You burn it and it's gone. And everyone whines about, we got to mine the lithium and the cobalt, and they wring their hands and fret about it. But wouldn't you rather extract something that you can reuse over and over again, like aluminum cans, or would you rather make more plastic bottles that ultimately end up in the ocean or a landfill, right? So I'm really passionate about that. And I think if I ever were to get out of the kind of cloud, AI, internet thing, that would be where I'd really want to work. Not because I know a lot about it, but because in my heart, I believe it's unbelievable to me how long we have sat around wringing our hands, like doing nothing. Token gestures, little pilot projects. Look, we built a few windmills. Good. Why don't we build like 100,000 of them? Well, they're expensive, and some people think they kill the birds. And I'm like, you guys, we're running out of time here. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the clock is ticking.
Right.
And there's just endless debate and hand-wringing, and it just drives me nuts. Because what world are we leaving our children with or our grandchildren with? I mean, it's going to be unrecognizable. Lahaina is gone. That was my childhood. I loved the banyan tree. I remember from my earliest memories. I've taken my children there and had, shave ice under that banyan tree. And the thought that is gone in an instant, and that's not a fluke, that's what's happening. And right now, I was supposed to go camping this weekend. Camping trip canceled because the smoke is so bad in eastern Washington again. Wildfires in Canada. Canada never used to burn. It was too cold.
That's right.
So there is something that I am very passionate about. It breaks my heart to see how little we are doing in practice to really meaningfully move the needle on that. And if I could find a way to somehow help with that, that would be where I would put all of my energy. Because if we screw that up, none of the rest of it really matters. It's the cascading failure scenario there. And so, of course, there are people that will say, well, what if it's not as bad as that? What if it's just a cyclical thing? What if it really ends up being overblown? What if it's just hysteria? What if it's natural cycles in the climate? I'm like, you know what? Let's just go down that path for a second. What if it isn't? I think Elon Musk said something like, this is the stupidest experiment humanity has ever done. Because if it goes well, we all breathe a bunch of diesel soot and coal soot. That's the best case scenario. But what if it goes wrong? And I mean really wrong. This could be a civilization-ending disaster. And why would we gamble with something like that, Do I think it's going to wipe out all of civilization? No. Do I think it's going to cause massive economic damage, wars? Yeah, I believe that. I think as much as I wish that it weren't true, the evidence is what it is. And even if you are a climate denier and you don't care about that part of it, the fact that we sit here and suck particulates from burning fossil fuels in our population centers, like they've proven that diesel soot is like breathing lead dust for children. It's that damaging to the brain. at a minimum, we should be moving the production of energy away from population centers. And even if all you do is buy an EV and charge it using electricity made from burning coal, at least you can burn the coal hundreds of miles away where people don't have to breathe the soot. Imagine a future where cities don't have smog, where there is no smog, where there is no, air pollution problem, where we don't have to constantly bolt on more emissions control systems to combustion engines to try to limit the noxious gases they spew. So I don't know. I think EVs are super important. I wish that we were doing more on that front. And again, I think one of the other great things about EVs is that they take a diversity of input fuels. You don't need oil. It's one option, but you can make electricity 1,000 different ways. So to me, the future electrification is probably the great challenge for our times and where I would put my time and energy. And hopefully generative AI will help us come up with novel ideas for how we can further improve that technology that maybe we wouldn't have come up with as quickly. So maybe those two things are meant to go together. I don't know.
Well, Jared Reimer, thank you so much for your time today. We're going to wrap up with our 3 questions. Are you ready?
Sure.
All right. So how old are you now?
I am 46 years old.
Okay, so you're 46. Go back 30 years to when you were 16 years old.
Yeah.
And in our studio, normally we have a couch. I would say kick off your shoes, lay down on the couch, close your eyes. What advice in all the experience you have to date would you give yourself at 16 years old, knowing what you know now?
Well, first one, definitely pick your company very carefully. Pick the people that you work with or are friends with very, very carefully. Have an exceedingly high bar. And don't feel bad if you decide that for whatever reason, someone that you work with or that you're in a relationship with isn't the right person. Like, it's better to not cut your losses, but to be very selective. And that's not selfish. It's actually sort of selfless because you're causing all manner of downstream harm to yourself and others by perpetuating those things. Another one would be definitely do not get married or have children until you're 30. Because in your 20s, you think you know what you want, you think you know who you are, you think you know all of these things, and you don't really know shit. You think you do. That's the problem, is you have this confidence that you've figured it all out and you know what you want and where your life is headed, and you have all these plans and ideas and this roadmap, at least I did. And it turns out none of that came true. Like, none of it worked out or played out the way I expected it to. And that was really hard for me. And a lot of it was because I had this certainty about all these things that in hindsight, for example, there was a point in my life before I had children when I was 100% certain I would never have kids. Absolutely no question. And now I have 3, and it was the best thing I ever did. But I didn't understand that when I was in my 20s. So back to the 16-year-old, I think you don't really know yourself or what you want until you're 30, and getting married or having children before then, at least to me, is premature, and the odds of failure probably are much higher. Other things I would have given the 16-year-old. I think the default behavior in our country is to keep buying and accumulating things. You look at the garages of many Americans, there's no cars in them because there's just so much stuff, right? Bikes, skis, camping equipment, toys, clutter. And I read this thing once. It said, look around, look at all these things. Those things used to be money. And that money used to be time. And time is the one thing you really can't make more of, right? I mean, it's a very finite and dwindling resource. And I think if I could rewind to 16, I think I would have done a better job at accumulating less crap and spending even more of my time and resources on experience. And I've traveled a lot. I mean, I've been to over 30 countries. Like, I've traveled a heck of a lot. I would do more. I would travel as much as possible, especially when you're young, especially when you're not, tied down with like a job and a mortgage and children and whatever else. Travel to me is like the ultimate way to learn. So that's another thing I guess I would tell my 16-year-old self is get out there, grab a backpack, and go as far and long as you can, and do it until the last penny is gone. because you can always make more money, right? But the window of opportunity when you're truly free and unencumbered like that, that's a very, very brief period of time. And until you retire, you can't have it back. And by the time you retire, you're probably not quite as physically capable of tolerating a $4 a night, hostel bed, and probably already filled with ideas about how the world is or isn't. When you're young and don't have a lot of money and don't really have any responsibilities, you have a form of freedom that is basically impossible to recreate once it's gone. So I've actually told my kids that they should take a gap year between high school and college and go somewhere. Like, do it, You can go get a job and teach English in Asia. You can go to Europe and go be a backpacker. You can do whatever you want, but you don't have to immediately go right into university. When I got into university, I powered through it. I did undergraduate CS in 4 years flat. Most people took 5. I immediately went into grad school. Didn't skip a beat. Powered through that. Why? What's the rush? I wish I could go back and take all the classes that were not on the core curriculum to get a computer science degree. What's the hurry? I just felt some pressure, right?
Right. Well, that's what it usually is. It's the pressure to make decisions, to keep up with what society has.
That was in my head.
Exactly.
No one applied that pressure to me.
No, it's all usually.
It was all self-inflicted.
So it's our last day on earth, God forbid. It's just me and you. It's our last meal together. Your choice. What are we eating and what are we drinking?
I think it's going to sound a little bit hedonistic. There's a restaurant called Cloud 9 at Aspen. I don't know if you've ever been there before. I really liked the whole, mountaintop, snowcat, steak dinner, champagne, beautiful starry night. Perfect. It's one of the best places in the world to ski. It's kind of gross, but they actually, I think, are the world's #1 retailer of Vouv. And there's so much of it sold that the carpet is saturated with champagne. It's a little bit hedonistic or maybe even gross in kind of a Roman sense of the term. But there's nothing like Aspen. There's nothing like Colorado skiing. Like, to me, if I had terminal illness and I had a very small period of time left, I would drop everything and go to Colorado and just ski as much as possible. So in our studio, you'll see behind me, we have a black door. And we have a grand piano, a drum set, and electrical and acoustical guitars in the studio. If you could have any band or musician walk through that black door and play us a song, they could be living or deceased. Who is it? Who's walking through the door, and what song are they playing us? That's a tough one. Oh, you've got me with that. There'd be the easy answers, Bob Marley would be like the super easy one. I've always loved The Cure, like my whole life. Even their newer stuff, I think, is still good. They're one of the few bands that has kept putting out good music, so that'd be maybe a contender. Still love Metallica. They're still going strong. I can't believe it. They're still doing it. I don't know. My musical tastes have changed over the years a bit. So if you had to today, who would you want? I would have The Cure play Love Song. Fantastic. Well, Jared, thanks so much for joining us today. If you're interested in listening to more episodes on the Ben Reinberg I Own It show, kick that right-hand button and click subscribe. Feel free to click the like button as many times as possible so we see out there in the ether. Let it go viral. To follow me, go to benreinberg.com. You can follow me on all different social media platforms. And feel free to log on to our company, AllianceCGC.com. We are the leaders in investing in commercial real estate throughout the United States. And feel free to click on our new fund, the Alliance Medical Property Fund. We are the leaders in investing in medical office space throughout the United States. If you're interested and are a credit investor and want to invest passively in commercial real estate, feel free to reach out to us. Jared Reimer, thank you so much for your time. It was great seeing you, and thanks for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the I Own It podcast with Ben Reinberg. To hear our past episodes and connect with Ben, visit benreinberg.com.